Hello, and welcome to Spring Security 6, the next generation. If you haven't already, I invite you to go ahead and scan the 3D barcode or the bit.ly link to get your source code for this presentation. Today we're going to be talking about Spring Security 6, how to get to Spring Security 6, and also kind of get around to some of the new features in Spring Security 6 as well. I'm the project lead for Spring Security, and if you see me around, I'd invite you to come say hi to me. I'd love to talk to you about Spring, security, or anything else that's on your mind. Speaking of talking about security, if you haven't done so already, I'd like to see you at the Application Security Roundtable. So go ahead and sign up for that if you haven't done so already. There's very limited availability, so I encourage you to do so quickly. Because those roundtables are kind of, they're much smaller groups. It's a great opportunity to talk about any of the questions that you might have with security related things, particularly about Spring. It'll be hosted by Joe Granja, one of the other Spring Security team members, and myself. And there's some other security related talks as well. If you haven't already signed up for those, I'd encourage you to do that as well. Monday 1:20, we're having a talk on securing web apps in Kubernetes using Spring Authorization Server. There's a talk at 4 p.m. on Wednesday on SAML. And then there's a workshop on Thursday at 9 a.m. Talking about how to do OAuth 2 in Spring Security. All of those should be great presentations. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys all to sign up for that. What presentation wouldn't be complete without a disclaimer? It's standard disclaimer, just anything that's in the future is basically not guaranteed when it'll be done or if it'll be done. And then I'd like to thank you for getting through all of my slides, because I'm not much of a slide person, and hopefully you aren't either, because we're going to be doing live coding and demo for the rest of the talk. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and switch over and take a look at a demo application that I put together. We're going to start off by looking at a Spring Boot application that's done in 2.7, you can see here. And then I've already overridden the version to Spring Security 5.8, the latest version. And the reason for that is that's kind of the first step you get to migrating. Spring Security migration to 6, we really want to set you up for success, so we allow you to do incremental adjustments to the app before doing the big switch over to 6, because as you know, we've left the standard servlets and stuff like that, so there are some things that have to happen all at once, but there's a lot of things that you can do up front to prepare, and we're going to walk through some of that for you today. So we have this application, and it has the standard starters in there, nothing surprising. And then we also have, this is a very simple application, so we're going to go through it very quickly just to show you. Nothing up my sleeve. Index controller sends us to the index HTML page. It links to the user controller, sends us to the user view page. We have a Spring Security application, just has a main method. And then the heart of it, this application right now, is the security configuration file, which is no surprise because this talk is on Spring Security. This is just going to allow us to focus on the Spring Security aspects rather than the domain model. And here you can see that we have our application. And I didn't make the UI too pretty because I feel like if I did as a security person, you'd probably think that I wasn't very good at security if I had a very good UI. It has nothing to do with my skills, I promise you. But so here we go. We have the public page. We click on the user, and we're going to make that a little smaller. Type in a username and password, and we're logged in. We can go back to the public page, and we can log out. There's really not much to this application. But again, this will allow us to focus on what's important, and that's the Spring Security aspects. OK, so how do we migrate to Spring Security 6, you might be asking. And I'm glad you've asked that. The documentation actually has a great section on it. If you go to the latest documentation, you can see there's a link for preparation steps. And then it goes back to our previous version of the docs. and it talks about these preparation steps. Again, you can do a lot of this before you've actually gone to Spring Security 6. You can check off each one in turn, and we'll see some of those in this presentation. But depending on your application, you're going to have different steps. So we won't have time to do all of the steps, obviously, but this will kind of give you an idea of what to expect and how to go about doing it. And speaking of documentation, anyone seen the new docs yet? This is like a new thing within the Spring ecosystem. We've been working on the documentation. It's been something near and dear to my heart. You can now switch between the versions very easily. You can get to the other portfolio projects very easily. It's all about improving the navigation. We even have a search that searches the documentation, so you can see like architecture. The Spring Security docs have like nice diagrams of how everything works and fits together. So if you haven't checked that out, I know a lot of people haven't noticed that or seen that, but it really is has improved. And if you see any bugs in the doc, you know, we have a edit this page button, and it'll automatically set it up in your fork of GitHub. It doesn't fork for me because I have write permission to the repository, but it'll let you allow to submit a pull request really easily to our docs too. All right, so enough on that tangent. What are we going to do to migrate our application to the next version? The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a configuration annotation here. And the reason for that is because in Spring Security 6, we've removed the configuration annotation from the Enable Web Security. And the reason for that is it better aligns with the rest of the portfolio, first of all. And second of all, it allows you to specify things like proxy beans equals false. And that allows you to do things like the native compilation that you saw on the stage, the main stage earlier today. And then we can also go ahead and remove this web security configure adapter. And you know that it's one of the things you need to do because the IDE is telling us that it's deprecated. So we can do that. And then the override will obviously go away because it's not overriding any methods anymore. We can remove the protected if we want. And because I like to name things the way that I want to name them, we're going to call that name Spring Security. And then we're going to return this as http.build. And I do this first because let your IDE do the work for you. If you don't know the return type, just have the IDE do it for you. Okay? So we've done kind of a first few steps of that. I'd encourage you, we're just going to do this to kind of show you. We've done a few of the steps migrating to Spring Security 6, but we haven't actually migrated, but we're preparing for it. But our app still works just as you would have expected. So I encourage you to do it incrementally. That's kind of one of the main points of this is it's easy to do incremental improvements to this towards getting to Spring Security 6. Another thing that we want to do is we want to override this method. So this method is using the old authorization APIs. Anyone use the old authorization APIs with the voters and the access decision managers? I see a few hands. Anyone want to get up on stage and explain all that? Or is it kind of, okay. We have a new API called Authorization Manager that is much simpler. And we're going to go over that in great detail. Well, we'll go over that in some detail a little bit later. But switching over to this method is actually switching us over to using the new Authorization Manager API. So we're kind of doing this early to make sure there's no problems because there are some subtle differences. The next thing that we have that's highlighted is this pattern. Does anyone notice anything wrong with this? Does anyone notice anything wrong? No one wants to raise their hand. That's OK. So if you look at this, it says, if the ANT matcher, if it matches /user, then you must be authenticated. And if we look at our user controller also says /user. But there's some interesting things going on here. There's a little bit of a mismatch. If I type in /user, it goes to the login page. But what if I do with a slash at the end? It bypasses it. Well, what's going on there? ANT matchers has no awareness of Spring MVC's routing logic. And so a long time ago, we have this MVC matchers that we created. That'll catch it. We won't restart and show you, but that'll catch it. But both are deprecated. And why are that? Well, the reason is a lot of people go over to their favorite pair programmer, Stack Overflow, and they copy paste it, And they get it from these old things, and they don't look at the context. And the context really matters. If you're using an MVC app, you need to use the MVC matchers. If you're not, then you can use the ANT matchers. So we decided that we would make it easier for people to do the right thing, and we added request matchers. Request matchers can actually pick the right choice for you. And so we want you to migrate to request matchers. All right, so the next thing that we have here is not actually related to Spring Security 6, but it's actually part of Spring Security 6.1. So we're going to go ahead and also kind of prepare for that. In here, we used to do this DSL with the ANDs. And it's been my experience that people either love that style of DSL or hate it. I haven't really found many people in between. And the history of that goes back to quite a ways, and it was before Java 8, before Lambdas, which is part of the reason why it exists, but it was also to make the migration from the XML easier. So you can see here, this chunk of Java code, it has like HTTP, form login, login page. It kind of corresponds to this, HTTP, form login, login page. It's supposed to make it easy, and those ands are not only necessary just to, like for making the DSL change to reflect the current context, but also they kind of reflected the end of the XML tag, which the end of the XML tag is also kind of switching the context for you as well, because it ends the attributes for that property. So that's kind of where that came from, but we can do a lot better now. So we'd really like everyone to switch over to the new API that takes advantage of Lambdas. And so in Spring Security 6.1, we actually deprecate the non-Lambda methods. So we're just going to migrate that over, so we're ready for 6.1 as well. And now we're using the Lambda style. And you'll notice that we're using a Lambda for here. It helps contain this within its own configuration. And then if you don't have any customizations, you just use this with defaults. And that's partially because if we had no parameters in there, it would go back to the old method. So we can't actually have a method with 0 arguments because that was already doing something. All right, so we've taken a bit of time to see how this works, but let's talk about some of the new features in Spring Security 6 and some of the new defaults. Each time we get to a new major release, we take the opportunity to do breaking changes. And I know breaking changes are no fun for anyone, but the thing is, security evolves rapidly. And we need to make sure that each generation of Spring Security has more secure defaults. But we also don't want to have you surprised when you migrate to Spring Security 6. So what can you do to prepare yourselves? Well, our guides will actually allow you to opt into these defaults eagerly. So we can just do this. We're going to opt into the new support. Well, I guess it's not that new. We're going to opt into the new default for cross-site request forgery handling. Does anyone know what cross-site request forgery handling is? There's some hands. OK, so cross-site request forgery handling. We're not going to go into that in detail, but you can check it out on the documentation. But it's basically a way to prevent, if someone didn't log out of their site, another site from attacking across the other site. So we need to do this. So we're just going to opt into this by default. And what is this doing? This is providing support for an attack called breach. Has anyone heard of breach? OK, no hands, but probably just people waking up in the morning. I don't know. Breach is a type of side channel attack. Anyone know what a side channel attack is? That's great, because this is the great thing about security. We get to go down the rabbit hole together. You know, it's always a rabbit hole, right, with these things. So side channel attack is a type of attack where there's a flaw in the implementation rather than in the algorithm or the protocol itself. And in a category of a side channel attack is called a timing attack, one that is pretty easy to explain. So let's say that you have someone that's trying to hack a password, right? And the password, the actual password is all A's, and the attacker submits all Z's, okay? Algorithm, or an implementation might actually compare these passwords and say, is A equal to Z? No. Well, they're not equal, so it stops. But then consider if the attacker did this, right? Are the A's equal? Yes. Are these A's equal? Yes. Are these A? There's going to be even though it's very fast, a computer's very fast, attackers can actually measure the difference between how long it takes to measure, to check that password. So what is the solution? You need to actually do a time-safe comparison on equals for sensitive information. Spring Security does this for you automatically, by the way, when you're doing password checks, signature checks, and stuff like that. But these are things that you need to think about. And this is a type of side channel attack. Well, going back to breach. Breach is a different type of side channel attack, and we won't go into the details of exactly how it's implemented, but it occurs when you're using HTTP compression. And if you're using HTTP compression with HTTPS, an attacker can actually steal parts of the plain text or the secrets from a user and any sensitive information. And one of those bits of information is, you guessed it, the cross-site request forgery token. And you might say, well, why this has been around for quite a while, why didn't you just do this much sooner? Well, it's any sensitive information. You think about it, responses are full of sensitive information, bank account numbers, social security numbers, et cetera. Most likely, a majority of your responses in your application, users aren't going to want to share, especially after they've logged in. And so the answer is not just protecting your cross-site request forgery token, it's protecting the whole response. And to protect the whole response, you either need to disable HTTP compression, or you need to enable something like Heal the Breach, which is a kind of a plug-in, if you will, that makes it so that the response length is varied, and then the attackers can't do it because they have to send out a whole bunch of requests, and then they run some analysis on it, and then that's how they figure it out. But if you're changing the size of the response, then it makes it so that they can't do that anymore. And then going back to this, well, why are you actually changing the default if we have to do all this together? Well, defense in depth. If you've done anything with security, you know security best practices are defense in depth. Spring Security does this, so does the whole industry. And if one thing fails, you want to make sure you have another layer of defense. So Spring Security is doing that defense in depth for you. Now, we've set this all up, and we'll go ahead and restart our app and just take a look at how it's implemented. And one way you might think that it's implemented is that that we just rotate the cross-site request forgery token on every request. You can see it's kind of down there at the bottom. It's rotating, changes all the time. And so if we changed it all the time, actually, there's a little bit of a problem. If you have multiple tabs open, that means only one tab is going to work. If you use the back button's not going to work. If you have asynchronous request, who knows what's going to happen, which one's going to work. And so really what it amounts to is what we've done is the first part of the cross-site request forgery token is random bytes, right? And we've encoded those bytes so that it'll be displayed on the page properly. And then the second half of the token is the actual token XOR'd with those bytes. So if you XOR it, and then you submit the XOR and the XOR'd value and the random bytes, then on the Spring Security side, when we check it against the actual token, we just take those XOR bytes and then XOR it with the random bytes, and then we get the original token. So it's always going to be the same token for that particular user session, but it looks like a different value on the page, which prevents the attack from happening. All right. So let's take a look at what happens if we, now I think we're ready to go ahead and upgrade to the next version of Spring Security. So we'll go ahead. We've done enough for this application. And anyone here know who Josh Long is? Anyone remember him? Okay, so Josh Long, he'd be very brave, and he'd show you the absolute latest and greatest snapshot. I'm not that brave, but we are going to do the latest milestone. So I can't compete with Josh. All right, here we go. We got 3, 2, 1 updated, and we're going to go ahead and start it up, and we're going to see a couple things. Actually, let's make sure that I I did not do that. We're going to take this off because this is by default now. And then we'll go ahead and start it. And make sure that it starts up. Yeah, so it says 321 milestone, or 32 milestone 1. And then if we go to our page, it's making us log in on that default page. And why is that? Did that on purpose, but just real quick, our value is still changing. But one of our defaults has changed that I didn't go over on purpose just so we could show you that. If we go back to our security configuration, we just gave a pattern for /user authenticated. Well, that's great, but we didn't have a pattern for that before, for the / before. And it used to be that if you didn't define a rule, it didn't do anything. But now, even if we log in, access is denied to /. So if you don't define a rule in Spring Security 6, it denies access. More secure defaults, right? If you don't define the rule, then you need to, then it'll be, so we can do something like this. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. This is a demo, so I'm going to do probably the wrong thing. I'm going to say any request permit all. But you probably want to say /permit all, and then after that say nothing if you want, or you could say any request deny all explicitly, however you want to do it. That stuff is kind of covered in the migration guide. But once we do that, we can restart, and you'll see that we're able to access the page again. All right? So we've seen quite a bit of stuff with migrating to Spring Security 6, and we talked about the authorization manager a little bit. But let's see what we can actually do with the authorization manager. Anyone ever want to do some custom things with authorization? You ever feel like in a Spring Security app? The old way you used to do that was using spell expressions, and those were very powerful. But you had to know your spell expressions. It could make things difficult to test. So now we have the ability to do this. I'm going to do this on a new line, so you can see it a little better. So now you can do it using a Lambda if you wanted even. So what it is the first argument is the authentication. So that's who identifies who the user is. And then the second one is the context of what we're authorizing. And part of that context is going to be the HTTP servlet request. So all I have to do is I could say new authorization decision. This is the result that we're going to return. And it's just kind of a rich object for deciding true or false. But you can include more information in there if you want. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make a very silly rule. Granted. So if we have the HTTP parameter granted, we're going to grant access to /user. Otherwise, you're not allowed to view it. Unlikely anyone is going to want to use this rule, but it kind of shows you that you can easily make up your own rules. So we'll come here, and we'll go to user. And it's going to make me log in because it can't decide if I'm allowed because there's no authentication yet. And then it says forbidden. But if I say granted, I'm allowed to. And even if I'm logged out, if I go to user, I'm allowed to. So the authorization rule is working, although it probably makes no sense, right? Like who wants that? So what do you say we make a rule that makes more sense? A customization that makes more sense and is a little more exciting. OK, so rather than doing our silly example, we're going to try to use, we are going to use Open Policy Agent. Anyone ever heard of Open Policy Agent or OPA? I see some heads nodding. It's kind of an industry standard for defining policies. And it uses Rego. And so we're gonna go ahead and use Open Policy Agent with Spring Security to do our authorization decisions. So let's do this. We'll start off by creating a document. And we'll put it in a folder called OPA, and we'll put it in a file called example, and then we'll put it in that file right there. And we'll start off by giving it a package of Spring. That just basically kind of gives it a namespace, if you will, standard to the Rego syntax. And then we're going to do an import, and we're going to import from future keywords in. We'll use that in a little bit, but we're just adding it up there at the top where it belongs. And then we'd like to do a default of allow, and we don't want to do true, right? Default allow false. That makes sense. And then, but we will allow is true if the count of grant is greater than 0. And this syntax is all documented on the Open Policy Agent. If you're not familiar with it, you can review it there. But so how do we know if we're going to grant access? Well, we're going to give a verbal description. If it's /user and has role of user, then we will grant it. That's just kind of a textual description of things, so don't read too much into that. And then we're going to say, how do we know that that actually is a rule that we are doing? And the way that we know that is by saying that if the input is a keyword, it's something that we're passing into this rules engine at some point. If the input request is an object that's going to be in our input, URI equals user, then I also want to has role of user. And unfortunately for us, has role does not actually exist. It isn't defined. It doesn't know what that is. But the good news is we can define it pretty easily. So we'll say has role, and then we will say concat. So you can't really do string concatenation with just a string, so we have to do it with an array. So looks a little weird, but basically all I'm doing is I'm concatenating what is passed in with role underscore user to follow the Spring Security conventions. And then that keyword that we talked about earlier, inputs.user.authorities. So we're checking to see if the role that was passed into it is in the authorities that are in the inputs. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Great. So then we're going to set up one more rule. And we're going to say grant equals slash is public. And then we'll just say if input.request.uri equals slash. So we don't need any roles for that. It doesn't really matter. We'll just let it all the time. Okay? And once we've done that, we can actually go ahead and test it out. So we'll go ahead and start up our Open Policy Agent. And it did start, so it doesn't look like we have any syntax errors at least. And we'll go ahead and make a request. So this HTTP request, I'm just using the REST API to interact with it. And it should say that I'm allowed, because I provided role user. And this is my request, and this is my response. And you can see there's that input that we were talking about, because that's kind of the keyword that it's looking for. And input.request.uri equals user. That's what we were talking about earlier. And this is input.user.authorities role equals user. Okay? And we didn't really use the principle, but you could easily imagine if you wanted to use that, you could. All right, so we've done that. Now let's see what happens if we use a different role. If we use a different role, it says allow equals false. So allow equals false means that at least for those couple rules, everything is looking good in terms of the policy document that we just set up. So how do we integrate this with Spring? Well, Spring can create REST clients pretty easily. Let's see if we can use the new Spring Framework REST client API to create one. All right, so we'll go ahead and start here, and we're going to just do an interface called OPA service. And then in here, we need to create a data structure that represents what we were seeing in the JSON request response. And you could do this using JSON annotations, but we're going to just use objects so it's easier to follow along with. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a record that is of type request, and it has a URI on it. Then we'll create a record that is of type user, principal, and authorities. So we've done that. And then the next thing that we'll need to do is we need to create a record of type input that composes those. So now we have our inputs. Now we need to go ahead and do our output. So for the output, we had a record. We need a record of type Spring. That was our namespace, if you remember. So that's why it's got Spring in there. And then it had a Boolean of allow, record of type. Let's try to get that a little higher so you can see. Record of type result with Spring in it. And then we had a record of type response that has the result in it. Now that we've created our data structure, all we need to do is we can say post exchange. So this is just a Spring annotation. And we're going to map it to v1/data. And then we can do our response. And then we check access. Request body, because that's going to be in our body, and we'll do input. Oh, we don't do that because it's an interface method. All right, so Spring's actually going to implement that for us. But to do that, we need to create a configuration class. So we'll create an OPA service configuration. And to do that, we'll create a configuration. And it needs to be a type of bean. And we're going to do OPA service. And we'll use our REST template builder. And then we're going to create a REST client. So to create a REST client, you can say REST client equals REST client builder. And that comes from our REST template builder.build. But we'll also need to customize this a little bit because you noticed in my path that I gave it, it wasn't a full path. So we're gonna make it so that there's a default base path for it. So do this HTTP local host 81. Oh, gotta hit the colon. 8181. So now we have that. And then we need a REST template adapter. And we'll create that from the REST client. So there's a little bit of boilerplate here, but in the end, we're going to end up with a oops. Oh, REST, that's why. My apologies, REST client adapter. Close REST client adapter dot create REST client. And then finally, we'll create a HTTP service proxy factory, and that's builder for the adapter. And now we can return factory.create OPA service.class. So that actually created our whole OPA service for us. And then we can go ahead and create a test for this. So if I go to OPA service, and then I can say create a test for it. We're going to make it a Spring Boot test. And let's see, we're going to do, of course, we'll do, all right, test, void run, and then we're going to do input, or actually, we got to start with the request. So we'll create our request equals new request. and it is a user for our test. Just going to align with exactly what we typed in our API earlier. I'm going to do a user equals and then we need to do, oops, got to make it new. And then we're going to do a input, new input with a request and a user. And then we're going to do we need to auto-wire our OPA service. So final OPA service. And then we'll use that OPA service to check access input. Assert. And we're going to make sure that this is allow, because that is what we had it set up to be. And of course, we need a static import here. And then we'll go ahead and run this test. And it fails. Let's see. Oh, no parameter resolution. So it looks like I think I know what's going on there. We must have missed the. All right, we're going to do what they do when you're running low on time. So anyone ever copy code off Stack Overflow? I hear some laughter. OK. Yeah, check out. Uh-oh. Check out. There we go. Now everything should be working. So our OPA service, oh, I forgot to do, I see what happened. All right, so we've created created our test. Let's see, where'd that go? Test on here, OPA service test. So this is making making our REST API call to there. And when it does that, it checks to make sure that the response is what we expected, and it is. And then we created an OPA authorization manager. So this is just that new authorization manager API that we talked about. And all it's doing is converting what we saw earlier in the Lambda into that request that we created and submitting it into that REST API. And then we updated our security configuration to use that authorization API. So any request is OPA. And with that said, I'm going to open it up for some questions. If you have any, feel free to ask them now, or if you want to ask them after the presentation, we can do it then too. Any questions? Yes. Could you repeat that, please?
Most of the time, OPA is one way. You kind of like manage the application. Most of the time, say, I'm going to take my LDAP.
OK. So the question is, in this example, we're using OPA for our authorization. But a lot of times, you'll be using something like LDAP for management. And yes, you can plug in anything you want into the authorization manager and for the authentication. For our authentication, we're actually just using in-memory authentication because it removes quite a bit of the variables that'll plague you during a demo. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah, that authorization manager API is just, you can use anything you want there. So you can plug in anything you want. Even something as meaningless as, is there a query parameter there?
Okay, CSR, when you say it's by default,
Is there a difference with the customization?
Yeah, by default, you get CSR token origin.
Oh yeah. So in the thing that I checked out, it actually just has it explicitly enabled again because we did like if I had more time, I would have done a few more demos. But yeah. You do not need the breach protection explicitly enabled for that. I think we're out of time, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you for joining me. It has been an honor and pleasure to have everyone in the room. If you do have questions, feel free to talk to me after the talk, but I want to clear the stage for the next person. Thank you again for everyone coming. I appreciate it.